It was supposed to be a dream come true. After years of saving and sacrifice, the Johnson family finally moved into a suburban neighborhood they thought would be their forever home. For Marcus and Renee Johnson, hard-working parents of two, this wasn't just about a house. It was about a safe, welcoming community for their children. But beneath the manicured lawns and neatly painted fences, there were rules. Strict rules. And when their youngest child, 8-year-old Malik, who used a wheelchair, needed a small ramp for accessibility, those rules became a weapon. The HOA claimed the ramp violated aesthetic guidelines. Fines came in the mail. Letters arrived with threatening language. What started as a simple ramp spiraled into a battle of pride, power, and principle. The Johnsons never imagined their fight for Malik's dignity would ignite outrage, inspire neighbors, and force the HOA into the public spotlight. The Johnson family's move into Willow Creek Estates was a moment filled with both triumph and relief. For Marcus Johnson, a postal worker who had worked double shifts for nearly a decade, and his wife Renee, a school counselor, home ownership had always felt just out of reach. They had endured cramped apartments, rising rents, and neighborhoods, where safety was not always guaranteed. Finally, with their savings pooled and a modest mortgage approved, they crossed the threshold into their new home, a tidy 2-story brick house with shutters painted navy blue and a lawn waiting to be mowed. To the Johnsons, it wasn't just a house, it was security. It was stability. It was a place where their children, Malik and his older sister Aliyah, could grow up with space to play, ride their bikes, and feel part of a community. For Renee, especially, it felt like planting roots. She often told friends that buying in Willow Creek Estates was the culmination of years of sacrifice. But their journey was not without challenges. Malik, their youngest, had been diagnosed with spina bifida at birth, leaving him reliant on a wheelchair for mobility. The Johnsons had long ago adjusted to the daily routines of accessibility, car modifications, wide hallways, bathroom adjustments. Their new home in Willow Creek was a blessing, but it came with one unavoidable issue. The front entrance had 3 concrete steps. At first, Marcus carried Malik up and down those steps every morning, but Malik was growing fast, and the task became heavier with each passing month. Aliyah, protective of her little brother, tried to help, but the responsibility weighed on Marcus and Renee. They knew a ramp was necessary, not just for convenience, but for safety and independence. The solution seemed simple enough. Marcus researched small prefabricated ramps. They found one that blended into the exterior, painted to match the trim. A weekend's work, a few bolts, and Malik would finally be able to roll into his own home without depending on someone's arms. When the ramp was installed, Malik's joy was unmatched. For the first time since moving in, he wheeled himself from the driveway to the living room. His laughter echoed through the house, and Renee wiped away tears watching her son claim his independence. To the Johnsons, it was a small change with life-changing impact. But in Willow Creek Estates, nothing went unnoticed. Within days, an envelope arrived in the Johnsons' mailbox. It bore the HOA's official seal, and the tone was unmistakable, stern, cold, and impersonal. The letter informed them that their wheelchair ramp violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. The board demanded its immediate removal. At first, Marcus thought it had to be a mistake. Surely no one could object to something so essential. He reread the letter twice, then handed it to Renee, who felt her stomach twist. Attached at the bottom was a warning: non-compliance would result in fines. The next HOA newsletter, slipped under doors throughout the neighborhood, carried a thinly veiled reminder: All residents are expected to comply with community standards to preserve the beauty and value of Willow Creek Estates. Though it never named them directly, the Johnsons felt the spotlight burning on their family. As days turned into weeks, the pressure grew. Each time Marcus walked to the mailbox, he found another envelope, sometimes a warning, sometimes a fine. Neighbors who once waved from their driveways now averted their eyes. Malik noticed the tension too. He asked why people were suddenly unfriendly. Renee struggled for words, trying to shield him from the truth. The HOA claimed the ramp was unsightly. They claimed it disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. To the Johnsons, it was cruelty, disguised as formality. It wasn't about a ramp. It was about dignity. The more Marcus and Renee resisted, the harsher the letters became. The fines stacked up. Threats of legal action appeared. What had started as a dream was now unraveling into a nightmare. Yet even in the quiet dread that settled into their home, the Johnsons held on to each other. Malik's laughter when he rolled down the ramp reminded them of why they had fought so hard to own this house in the first place. Renee began keeping a journal of every letter, every fine, every conversation with the HOA. Marcus snapped photos of the ramp from every angle, determined to prove it was safe and reasonable. The Johnsons didn't know it yet, but their fight was about to grow much bigger than their front yard. What they endured in silence was about to find a voice far beyond Willow Creek. Because sometimes injustice doesn't stay hidden. It sparks a fire. And this fire was about to spread. The letters kept coming week after week. What had started as a warning escalated into a constant stream of fines and demands. The Johnson family's joy at finally owning their dream home was slowly being suffocated under the weight of paper threats. Each envelope carried the same tone: remove the ramp or face legal action. The amounts owed stacked higher, climbing into the hundreds, then thousands. Marcus and Renee felt trapped, their American dream turning into an expensive cage. The neighborhood around them was no longer friendly. The casual smiles and waves disappeared. Some neighbors, once quick to chat about weather or yard work, began pulling their blinds shut when the Johnsons passed. A few even whispered at the end of driveways, their voices sharp with disapproval. Malik, sensitive to every shift, began asking why people seemed so cold. Renee told him not to worry, but inside her heart sank. The HOA's board members, the ones behind the endless letters, remained faceless. Their names appeared at the bottom of documents, but no one ever came forward to speak directly. The Johnsons were battling shadows, faceless enforcers of rules no one seemed willing to question aloud. The ramp stood as both a lifeline for Malik and a silent symbol of defiance. But change began in the smallest of ways. One evening, Marcus was mowing the lawn when his neighbor, Mrs. Harris, approached. She was in her 60s, with silver hair, pulled into a bun and sharp glasses that always seemed to catch the light. She glanced around nervously before speaking. Her words came out in a low whisper, as if she were confessing something forbidden. She told Marcus that she thought what the HOA was doing was wrong. She said her grandson used a walker, and she couldn't imagine anyone punishing her for trying to help him. She admitted others felt the same way, but were too afraid to speak out. The HOA held power in Willow Creek, power to fine, to threaten, even to foreclose if residents didn't comply. Fear kept people silent, but Mrs. Harris's words were a spark. Marcus carried them inside, shared them with Renee, and for the first time in weeks they felt a sliver of hope. They weren't alone. Renee began documenting everything more carefully, sensing that one day they would need proof. She snapped photos of Malik using the ramp, smiling in the afternoon sun. She recorded the dates of each fine. She compiled everything into a binder, determined to be ready if the board ever pushed them too far. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. Aaliyah was playing with friends in the yard when a white SUV pulled up in front of the house. A man in a crisp suit stepped out carrying a clipboard. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't smile. He walked straight to the ramp, scribbled notes and snapped photos. When Marcus confronted him, the man coolly said he was there on behalf of the HOA to assess violations. He added almost casually that if the Johnsons didn't comply, legal action could follow. Marcus's blood boiled, but Renee held him back, her hand gripping his arm tightly. The man left as quickly as he came, leaving behind a cloud of dread. That evening, Malik asked if they would have to move. It was a question that pierced Renee's heart. She assured him they weren't going anywhere, but she didn't know if that was true. The story might have remained confined to their quiet battles and fearful neighbors, if not for one moment of chance. Renee's cousin, visiting from out of town, snapped a photo of Malik rolling down his ramp, laughing with pure joy. She posted it online, adding a caption about the HOA's fight against a child's right to accessibility. She didn't think much of it, but within hours, the post spread. First it was shared among friends and family, then strangers began commenting, outraged, empathetic, furious. People couldn't believe an HOA would target a family for giving their disabled child independence. The story struck a nerve. It wasn't just about a ramp. It was about fairness, compassion, and justice. By the end of the week, the Johnsons' story was circulating on local forums. A neighborhood blog picked it up. Soon after, a small news station reached out, asking if they could cover the situation. At first, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He valued his privacy, his family's peace, but Renee reminded him, silence was what the HOA wanted. If they kept quiet, the board would win. When the local news crew arrived, Malik was shy at first. But as the cameras rolled, he proudly demonstrated how he used his ramp, his smile lighting up the footage. Renee spoke with calm strength, explaining their struggle, their fines, their fight to keep their son safe. Marcus added his voice too, steady but firm. That evening the segment aired and everything changed. Neighbors who had avoided them suddenly knocked on their door to apologize. Strangers sent letters of support. Some even offered money to help with the mounting fines. The Johnsons felt the shift like a tide turning. For the first time, they weren't just a family under attack. They were a family standing at the center of a growing movement. But with attention came new challenges. The HOA was furious. A fresh letter arrived, more aggressive than ever, accusing the Johnsons of defamation and warning of legal action for going public. The board wasn't just fighting over a ramp anymore. They were fighting to protect their authority, their control. The Johnsons were no longer battling in silence. Their fight had spilled into the public eye, and the world was watching. The ramp on their front porch had become more than wood and bolts. It had become a symbol. And symbols have power. The question was, how far was the HOA willing to go to silence that symbol? The Johnson story was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. It had leapt beyond the quiet cul-de-sacs of Willow Creek and into the wider world. What began as whispers among neighbors and a short segment on local TV exploded across the internet in a matter of days. By the end of the week, hashtags bearing Malik's name and the phrase "let kids play" were trending. The ramp had become a rallying cry. Major news outlets began picking up the story. First regional stations, then national broadcasts. Photos of Malik, his bright smile as he rolled down the ramp, his hands raised in victory, were splashed across. Headlines. Articles framed the HOA as heartless enforcers of rules, blind to compassion, blind to humanity. The Johnson family became a symbol for every parent who had ever fought against unfair systems. For Marcus and Renee, life shifted into something unrecognizable. Their phone rang constantly. Journalists wanted interviews, advocacy groups reached out with support, and strangers sent donations through online fundraisers. It was overwhelming, but also empowering. They weren't just speaking for themselves anymore. They were speaking for families across the country. But attention brought fear, too. The HOA doubled down. Another official letter arrived, more intimidating than ever. It accused the Johnsons of creating unwarranted media attention and of damaging the reputation of the Willow Creek community. The board threatened a lawsuit, claiming the family was misrepresenting the facts. They demanded the ramp's removal within 10 days, or further action would be pursued to the fullest extent of the law. Marcus read the letter aloud at the dinner table. His hand shook, though his voice stayed steady. Renee kept her composure, but Malik, now old enough to understand far more than they wished, sat in silence. After a moment, he quietly asked if he was the reason their neighborhood hated them. That night, Renee didn't sleep. She replayed every moment in her mind, the excitement when they first moved in, the pride on Malik's face when he used his ramp, the creeping fear that had followed. She knew now this fight wasn't just about one child. It was about all children, all families who had been silenced by boards that valued control over compassion. The next morning, Renee made a decision. If the HOA wanted silence, they would get the opposite. She began speaking more boldly to reporters, not just about her family's struggle, but about the broader issue of accessibility. She connected with disability rights organizations, many of whom were eager to amplify the cause. Malik's story became a platform for advocacy, a reminder of the laws meant to protect families like theirs, laws the HOA seemed to ignore. Rallies began forming outside the neighborhood gates. Parents pushed strollers, children carried handmade signs, activists held banners. They chanted for justice, for compassion, for Malik's right to dignity. At first it was a handful of people, then dozens, then hundreds. The Johnsons watched from their porch as cars lined the streets and voices rose in unison. Renee held Malik close, her heart pounding as she realized this movement had grown far beyond their control. Marcus, usually cautious and reserved, felt something awaken inside him. He saw the possibility of change, not just for his family, but for others who had endured the same battles in silence. But inside the gates of Willow Creek, the atmosphere turned toxic. The HOA board convened emergency meetings, their members angry, defensive, and desperate to regain control. Some residents rallied behind the Johnsons, leaving supportive notes at their door or quietly slipping donations into their mailbox. Others, fearful of rising tensions, accused the family of ruining the neighborhood's reputation. Factions formed, friendships fractured, and the once pristine community felt on the brink of collapse. And through it all, the ramp remained, solid, unmovable. The board finally escalated the fight to court. They filed a lawsuit demanding the ramp's removal, citing violation of community design standards. Their arguments were framed in sterile, legal language about uniformity, property values, and architectural harmony. But beneath the surface, their stance was clear. Control mattered more than compassion. The Johnsons prepared for battle. Lawyers reached out, many offering services pro bono, moved by the injustice of the case. Disability advocates promised to stand by their side. Even neighbors who had once been silent began speaking out, emboldened by the national spotlight. The trial became a media spectacle. Reporters packed the courthouse steps. Protesters held signs outside chanting Malik's name. Inside, the Johnson family sat together in the front row, their hands interlocked, their faces calm but resolute. The HOA board members arrived in polished suits, their expressions cold, their confidence unshaken. They believed the law would favor their rules. After all, they had enforced these guidelines for years without question. But this was different. In the courtroom, the Johnsons' lawyer presented a powerful case. They argued that the ramp was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a necessity, protected under federal accessibility laws. They showed photos of Malik, laughing as he gained independence, contrasted with the HOA's relentless fines and threats. They highlighted the cruelty of punishing a family for ensuring their child's dignity. The room fell silent as Renee took the stand. Her voice didn't waver. She described the humiliation of constant fines, the fear of losing their home, the heartbreak of seeing her son doubt his worth. She spoke of dreams, the dream of a safe home, a welcoming neighborhood, and a fair chance for her children. Her words echoed with raw emotion, breaking through the polished arguments of the board's attorneys. When Malik was brought into the courtroom, wheeling himself confidently down the aisle, the atmosphere shifted. His presence was undeniable proof of why the ramp mattered. He didn't need to say a word. His smile spoke volumes. The judge listened intently, taking notes, asking sharp questions. The outcome remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Johnsons' fight was no longer just about a ramp. It was about what kind of community America wanted to be. One where rules outweighed humanity, or one where compassion prevailed. As the day ended, the court recessed, leaving both sides on edge. The Johnsons returned home exhausted but strangely hopeful. They knew the decision could change everything. That night, Renee stood on the porch looking at the ramp illuminated by the soft glow of a streetlight. She realized it had become more than wood and nails. It was a statement, a line drawn in the sand. And no matter what the court decided, the world was watching. The fight was far from over. The next chapter would determine whether justice could truly stand against power. The Johnsons awoke each morning knowing the world was still watching. Their case had transcended the neighborhood dispute it started as and evolved into a cultural flashpoint. It wasn't only about the ramp anymore. It was about justice, compassion, and whether power could be used to crush ordinary families. The court case loomed like a storm cloud, but outside the courtroom, another battle raged. The court of public opinion. National talk shows debated the issue, with pundits arguing about property rights versus human rights. Some HOA defenders claimed rules were rules, that exceptions eroded the foundation of community governance. But voices of compassion were louder. Civil rights activists, disability advocates, and ordinary Americans rallied around the Johnsons, calling the HOA's actions not just cruel but un-American. Each news cycle brought more attention, more division, and more pressure. For the HOA board, the scrutiny was suffocating. For the Johnsons, it was a lifeline, reminding them that they weren't fighting alone. But attention came with costs. Renee felt it most acutely. She had become the face of the movement, fielding interviews and speaking at rallies. Cameras caught her every expression, every word dissected by strangers. While she wanted to stay strong, the exhaustion carved deep lines into her face. At night, after Malik went to bed, she often sat quietly in the kitchen, staring at the mounting stack of legal documents. The ramp that had once brought joy now carried the weight of an entire nation's hopes. Marcus struggled too, though differently. He kept working his long shifts, trying to provide stability, but every day he returned home to protesters outside the gates, neighbors divided by loyalty or resentment, and a wife stretched thin by the spotlight. He longed for normalcy, for quiet evenings where his biggest concern was Malik's homework or what to cook for dinner. But normal had vanished, replaced by chaos, and Malik, though shielded as much as possible, could not escape the tension. At school he was treated like a symbol, classmates whispering about his famous ramp. Teachers tried to protect him, but the weight of being a cause, rather than just a boy, pressed on him. One night, he asked his parents why people who didn't even live in their neighborhood cared so much. Marcus knelt beside him and explained that sometimes the smallest fights revealed the biggest truths. Inside the courthouse, the battle escalated. The HOA's legal team began to play dirty. They dredged up every possible code violation the Johnsons had ever committed: minor lawn maintenance warnings, a fence panel that had once leaned too far, even an old noise complaint from a backyard birthday party. They painted the family as chronic rule breakers who disrespected community standards. But the Johnsons' lawyers countered skillfully. They reminded the court that none of those minor issues compared to the fundamental right of a child to access his home safely. They pointed out that the HOA had ignored federal disability protections and worse, had weaponized rules meant to build community against the very people they were supposed to protect. The case became a chess match, each move carefully planned, each argument weighed not just in legal terms but in how it would play in headlines the next morning. Still, the HOA board refused to back down. They grew increasingly desperate, not just to win, but to reclaim their authority. Leaked emails revealed their disdain for the Johnsons and for the national spotlight. One message described the family as troublemakers who should have chosen a neighborhood better suited to their kind. When the message surfaced, it ignited a firestorm. The phrase "their kind" rang out across airwaves, interpreted by many as both racial and classist. It inflamed tensions further, framing the conflict as not only about disability, but about systemic prejudice against black families, seeking the American dream. The Johnsons tried to shield themselves from the vitriol, but there was no escaping it. They received letters of love and solidarity, but also hate mail, some of it vicious. Police advised them to stay cautious as threats emerged online. Yet even amid fear, there was resilience. On weekends, neighbors who supported them gathered in the yard, planting flowers around the ramp, bringing meals and lifting spirits. Children played on the lawn, laughing freely, reminding everyone why the fight mattered. Community lines were drawn, but compassion continued to bloom in unexpected places. The day of closing arguments arrived like the final act of a play. The courthouse was overflowing. Protesters and counter-protesters clashed on the steps, their chants echoing through the city. Inside, cameras were barred, but sketch artists captured the tension in careful strokes. The HOA's lawyer made their case with cold precision. They argued that homeowners' associations existed to preserve uniformity, to protect property values, to ensure fairness. If exceptions were made for one family, they claimed, chaos would follow. The ramp was a violation, plain and simple. Then came the Johnsons' lawyer. Their argument was not cold, but fiery. They spoke of America's promise of equality, of laws designed to protect the vulnerable. They reminded the court of Malik's face, of the joy a simple ramp had given him. They framed the HOA's fight, not as protection of community, but as cruelty disguised as order. Finally, Renee was given a chance to speak again. She rose slowly, her voice steady, though her eyes glistened with tears. She spoke of her family's dream to live in Willow Creek, of the pride they felt in their home, of the anguish the HOA had caused. She did not beg, nor accuse. She simply told the truth. Her words left the courtroom in silence. When the gavel fell, the judge announced that a ruling would be delivered within weeks. Until then, both sides would wait. For the Johnsons, the wait was agony. Every day felt stretched thin with tension. Reporters still camped outside, speculating on the outcome. The ramp remained in place, standing as both a symbol of resistance and a target of resentment. Renee found herself oscillating between hope and fear. Marcus poured his energy into Malik, trying to give him as normal a childhood as possible, though he too carried the weight of uncertainty. Malik, though young, sensed the heaviness in the air. Yet he remained the brightest light of the family, his laughter and resilience reminding them of the stakes. The neighborhood grew quieter, as though the community itself held its breath. But the Johnsons knew silence was deceptive. Something was building. And when the decision finally came, it would ripple far beyond their cul-de-sac. Because this fight had become bigger than them. It was about justice, about dignity, about whether compassion could triumph over control. The ruling was coming. And no matter the outcome, nothing in Willow Creek or in America's conversation about power and fairness would ever be the same. The morning of the verdict dawned gray, as though even the sky hesitated to reveal what was coming. In Willow Creek, silence replaced the usual hum of suburban life. Driveways that normally echoed with children playing were empty. Curtains twitched. As neighbors peeked out, waiting, dreading, hoping. For the Johnsons, the day began with restless pacing. Renee could barely swallow her coffee, her hands trembling as she set the cup down untouched. Marcus dressed carefully, pressing his shirt with almost obsessive precision, as though neatness could impose order on chaos. Malik, sensing the gravity, sat quietly at the table, clutching a toy car he carried for comfort. By mid-morning they were on their way to the courthouse, flanked by supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for Malik" and "Compassion over Control." News cameras lined the streets, their red lights blinking like unblinking eyes, capturing every moment. The courthouse steps were a battleground of chants, supporters singing hymns of solidarity, while a smaller but loud group of HOA loyalists shouted about rules, order, and property values. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The benches creaked under the weight of spectators. Lawyers shuffled papers with nervous hands. The HOA board sat stiff and grim, their faces betraying nothing, but their eyes, cold, defensive, anxious, spoke volumes. The judge entered, and silence fell like a curtain. No one moved, no one breathed as the gavel struck. The ruling began not with a hammer blow, but with careful, deliberate words. The judge spoke of the purpose of homeowners, associations, of the responsibility to uphold bylaws, of the importance of community cohesion. The Johnsons braced themselves, fearing the preamble signaled defeat. But then the tone shifted. The judge acknowledged federal protections for individuals with disabilities, protections that superseded any HOA rules. They spoke of Malik directly, his right to access his own home safely, his right to dignity, his right to live without barriers imposed by arbitrary aesthetics. The gavel struck again, final this time. The HOA's ban was overturned. The fines were voided. The Johnsons were declared within their rights to keep the ramp. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen. Then, a wave of emotion surged through the crowd. Supporters wept openly, embracing one another. Reporters bolted for the doors, shouting updates into microphones. Renee buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with relief. Marcus placed a steadying hand on her back, his jaw clenched not from fear now, but from the flood of vindication. And Malik, wide-eyed, whispered the words his parents would never forget. So the ramp gets to stay? Yes, the ramp would stay. But outside the courthouse, triumph collided with fury. Supporters erupted in cheers, chanting Malik's name. Across the barricades, HOA defenders fumed, some shouting insults, others storming away in disgust. The story, already national, exploded across every news outlet within minutes. Headlines blared, HOA loses ramp fight and family triumphs over board's cruelty. In Willow Creek, the verdict divided the neighborhood even further. Some residents decorated their yards with blue ribbons in solidarity, symbols of support for the Johnsons and disability rights. Others posted angry letters on community boards, claiming the ruling was the death of neighborhood standards. Tension simmered at every block corner, every cul-de-sac, every whispered conversation between neighbors. The Johnsons themselves returned home to a scene they hadn't expected. Their lawn was covered in balloons, flowers, and handwritten notes from strangers and neighbors alike. One sign stood out. "This isn't just your victory, it's ours too." Yet even as joy flooded the family, shadows lingered. The HOA board, humiliated and furious, held an emergency meeting the very next day. Behind closed doors, they debated strategies. Some wanted to resign, fearing the mounting backlash. Others dug in their heels, determined to find new ways to assert authority. Pride kept them from apology. Anger kept them from retreat. Leaks from that meeting revealed a chilling truth. The board planned to retaliate. If they couldn't win, through the courts they would wield the full arsenal of HOA power. Constant inspections, excessive fines, every technicality twisted into a weapon. The Johnsons might have won the battle, but the war for their peace was far from over. Meanwhile, the media storm only intensified. National anchors sat at polished desks, debating whether the ruling signaled a broader reckoning for HOAs across America. Disability rights groups hailed the verdict as precedent-setting, while HOA lobbying organizations warned of chaos if boards lost their authority. The Johnsons were swept into the whirlwind. Interviews poured in, invitations to speak. At conferences, offers to turn their story into books, even documentaries. Renee and Marcus struggled to balance the attention with their desire for normalcy. All they wanted was to give Malik a safe, happy life, not to become the unwilling face of a national debate. Malik, ever innocent, adjusted better than anyone. To him, the ramp was no longer a battleground, but simply part of his daily joy. He raced his toy cars down it, laughed as friends joined him in games, and reveled in the freedom it provided. For him, the fight had always been about that simple freedom. But beneath the laughter, an unease lingered. The HOA wasn't finished. Neighbors who once smiled at the Johnsons now crossed the street, unwilling to take sides openly. Social gatherings grew tense, whispers cutting sharper than words. Willow Creek, once marketed as a perfect community, now bore scars of division too deep to ignore, and the Johnsons knew it. Victory had been sweet, but fragile. As night fell after the verdict, Renee stood on the porch, staring at the ramp illuminated by the porch light. It looked so ordinary, so small, yet it had carried the weight of their family, their dignity, their fight for justice. She wondered if peace would ever return, or if this was only the beginning of a longer struggle, because in Willow Creek, power never conceded easily. The board had lost in court, but the battle for control of the community had only just begun. In the days following the verdict, Willow Creek no longer resembled the pristine neighborhood once advertised in glossy brochures. The manicured lawns and identical facades could not conceal the fractures running through the community. Tension buzzed in the air like static electricity, felt in every glance exchanged at mailboxes, every strained greeting between neighbors. For the Johnsons, victory should have brought relief, but instead, it delivered a new reality. Their names were on television screens and news articles across the country. Supporters flooded their mailbox with letters of encouragement, donations, and heartfelt stories of their own battles against HOAs. Yet, along with kindness, came threats. Anonymous letters slipped into their mailbox warning them to move, emails filled with venom about ruining the neighborhood. The same ramp that symbolized freedom for Malik now felt like a beacon drawing both love and hostility. Inside the Johnson home, life carried on in uneven rhythms. Renee tried to anchor the family with routines, breakfast at the table, Malik's bedtime stories, evening prayers whispered with weary gratitude. But every knock on the door jolted her heart. Every car slowing outside sent Marcus to the window with clenched fists. Peace was elusive. The HOA board, shamed by the court loss, retreated at first into silence. Meetings were closed to residents, minutes vague and carefully worded. Yet whispers trickled out. Fines for minor violations suddenly increased. Trash bins left out for minutes too long earned warnings. Hedges deemed too tall were cited. Though the Johnsons were the focus of most scrutiny, other families began feeling the sting too. It was as though the board sought to remind the entire community who still held power. But something unexpected followed. Neighbors who once stayed silent began speaking up. Families who had once whispered complaints about the HOA found courage in the Johnsons' fight. A group of parents formed a coalition, demanding more transparency from the board. Petitions circulated, calling for new elections, and even the resignation of certain board members. The very foundation of the HOA's authority trembled, shaken not just by the court loss, but by the awakening of residents who realized they too had voices. National organizations took notice. Disability rights groups hailed the Johnsons as champions, inviting them to conferences. Advocacy lawyers offered their services pro bono to others facing similar discrimination. The Johnson family never sought to be symbols, yet they had become exactly that. A living reminder that ordinary people could push back against injustice. For Malik, the storm swirling around him was less visible, less comprehensible. To him, life was simpler. He had his ramp. He had freedom. He had the joy of racing down it with his toy cars, or watching his cousins slide toy trucks alongside him. What to adults was a legal and moral victory was, to a child, simply the chance to enter and exit his own home without fear or struggle. The innocence of his joy often softened the heaviness his parents carried, but the scars on the community deepened. Cookouts once shared among neighbors vanished. Streets grew quieter, laughter replaced by suspicion. Some families pulled away from the Johnsons, fearful of being associated with them. Others leaned closer, defiantly offering their support. Division became the new normal in Willow Creek, the ramp standing as both symbol and fault line. The HOA, desperate to reclaim control, launched a new campaign. Promises of beautification projects, stricter enforcement of rules for everyone's benefit, and glossy newsletters filled with spin. Yet their credibility had been shattered. For every new rule proposed, residents questioned motives. For every dollar spent, residents demanded receipts. The iron grip of authority no longer held unchallenged. In quieter moments, Renee wondered what the cost of their victory truly was. Their home was still theirs, their ramp still standing, but the peace they once craved seemed further away than ever. She wrestled with guilt that Malik had become the center of such controversy, guilt that Marcus bore the weight of constant vigilance, guilt that their neighbors now lived in such division. Yet deep within, she knew they had done what was right. That knowledge steadied her, even when the fear and fatigue threatened to consume her. Marcus, too, carried the heaviness, but he transformed it into action. He began attending more community meetings, not just to defend his family, but to advocate for fairness. He spoke for those too afraid to raise their voices, challenging the board's decisions with calm authority. Over time, he became a leader not by title, but by necessity. A man unwilling to be silenced, unwilling to see another family endure what they had. Months passed and slowly Willow Creek changed. The HOA board fractured, with resignations weakening its hold. New candidates stepped forward, ordinary residents tired of the arrogance and secrecy that had defined leadership. Elections loomed, and for the first time real change felt possible. The Johnsons' fight had lit a spark, and that spark had grown into a fire too strong to extinguish. Still, not all wounds healed. Some neighbors remained bitter, clinging to the belief that aesthetics mattered more than accessibility, rules, more than humanity. They looked at the ramp not as a symbol of justice, but as an eyesore, a reminder of defeat. For them, the story was one of loss. But history would not remember their bitterness. History would remember the ramp, the family, and the fight for dignity. On the anniversary of the verdict, the Johnsons held a small gathering at their home. Friends, neighbors, and supporters came together, sharing food, laughter, and stories. Children ran up and down the ramp, their joy unburdened by politics or rules. Renee watched from the porch, tears in her eyes, as she realized something profound. They had not just won a legal battle. They had carved out a new meaning for community. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was progress. As the sun set over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the homes, Renee whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. The ramp glowed in the twilight, a simple structure of wood and metal, yet infused with meaning far beyond its parts. It was more than an entryway. It was a symbol of resilience, of love, of a family's refusal to bow under injustice. The HOA had tried to ban their dream. Instead, they had amplified it. And in the end, the Johnson story became a reminder to all. Rules can shape a neighborhood, but compassion defines a community. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.